The History of the United States of America, USA, by the Bookteller 2025.
Part 1. Colonial Origins and the Path to Independence, 1607 to 1789.
Early colonial settlements and development. The history of the United States begins with the establishment of permanent European settlements in the early 17th century. The Virginia Company founded Jamestown in 1607, marking the first successful English colony in North America. This venture, initially driven by economic motives and the search for gold, faced numerous challenges including conflicts with indigenous Powhatan peoples, disease, and food shortages. The introduction of tobacco cultivation by John Rolfe around 1612 transformed Virginia's economy and established the foundation for plantation agriculture that would define much of the Southern colonial experience. The Plymouth colony, established by the Pilgrims in 1620, represented a different colonial model driven primarily by religious motivations. The Mayflower Compact, signed aboard the ship before landing, established principles of self-governance and majority rule that would influence later American political development. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, founded in 1630 under John Winthrop's leadership, further expanded Puritan influence in New England and established educational institutions including Harvard College in 1636. The middle colonies of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware developed distinct characteristics shaped by diverse religious and ethnic populations. Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn in 1681, became notable for its policy of religious tolerance and peaceful relations with Native Americans. The Dutch influence in New York, inherited from the New Amsterdam period, contributed to the colony's commercial orientation and cultural diversity. Colonial society and economic development. Colonial society evolved into distinct regional patterns by the 18th century. New England developed a mixed economy based on commerce, shipbuilding, fishing, and small-scale manufacturing. The Puritan emphasis on education and literacy created a society with relatively high levels of learning and civic participation. Town meetings became centers of local governance, fostering democratic practices and political engagement. The middle colonies emerged as the breadbasket of colonial America, producing wheat and other grains for export. Cities like Philadelphia and New York became major commercial centers, attracting diverse immigrant populations including Germans, Scots-Irish, and various religious minorities. This diversity contributed to greater religious tolerance and social flexibility compared to other regions. The southern colonies developed an economy increasingly dependent on slave labor and cash crop production. The expansion of rice cultivation in South Carolina and Georgia, alongside tobacco in Virginia and Maryland, created a plantation system that concentrated wealth among a planter elite while relying on the forced labor of Africans and their descendants. By 1750, enslaved people comprised approximately 20% of the colonial population, with much higher concentrations in the South. Imperial tensions and growing resistance. The relationship between Britain and its American colonies grew increasingly strained following the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. The war's conclusion left Britain with substantial debt and a vast North American territory, requiring administration and defense. Parliament's attempts to tax the colonies to help pay war debts and administrative costs triggered resistance based on the principle of no taxation without representation. The Sugar Act of 1764 and Stamp Act of 1765 marked the beginning of systematic colonial opposition to British taxation. The Stamp Act Congress of 1765 represented the first coordinated intercolonial political response, while boycotts of British goods demonstrated the economic leverage colonists could exercise. The repeal of the Stamp Act in 1766 was accompanied by the Declaratory Act, asserting Parliament's right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The Townshend Acts of 1767 renewed tensions by imposing duties on imported goods, including tea, glass, and paper. Colonial resistance intensified with the formation of non-importation agreements and the emergence of groups like the Sons of Liberty. The Boston Massacre of 1770, though involving only 5 civilian deaths, became a powerful symbol of British oppression through effective propaganda campaigns. Revolutionary crisis and war. The Tea Act of 1773 and subsequent Boston Tea Party marked a critical escalation in the imperial crisis. Parliament's response through the coercive acts, dubbed the Intolerable Acts by colonists, in 1774, included closing Boston Harbor and effectively ending Massachusetts self-government. These measures backfired by generating sympathy for Massachusetts throughout the colonies and prompting the convening of the First Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia in September 1774, brought together delegates from 12 colonies, Georgia abstained, to coordinate resistance to British policies. The Congress endorsed the Suffolk Resolves declaring the coercive acts unconstitutional and established the Continental Association to enforce non-importation, non-consumption, and non-exportation agreements. Armed conflict began at Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775, when British forces attempting to seize colonial military supplies encountered local militia. The battles marked the beginning of armed resistance and prompted the Second Continental Congress to assume governmental functions, including the establishment of the Continental Army under George Washington's command. The decision for independence evolved gradually through 1775 and early 1776. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in January 1776, provided powerful arguments for separation from Britain and helped shift public opinion toward independence. The Declaration of Independence, adopted on July 4, 1776, articulated the philosophical justification for revolution based on natural rights theory and listed specific grievances against British rule. War for Independence and its conduct. The Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783, presented significant challenges for the newly declared United States. The Continental Army faced problems of supply, training, and coordination while confronting the world's most powerful military force. George Washington's leadership proved crucial in maintaining Army cohesion and morale through difficult periods, including the winter at Valley Forge, 1777-1778. The war's character evolved from initial expectations of quick resolution to a prolonged conflict involving multiple theaters and international participants. The American victory at Saratoga in October 1777 proved pivotal by convincing France to enter the war as an American ally, transforming a colonial rebellion into a global conflict involving European powers. The Southern theater became increasingly important after 1778 as British strategy shifted to exploit perceived loyalist strength in the region. However, the war in the South devolved into brutal, irregular warfare, and British forces found less loyalist support than anticipated. The campaign culminated in the Siege of Yorktown in 1781, where combined American and French forces compelled the surrender of British General Cornwallis. Confederation period and Constitutional Convention. The Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781, provided the first framework for national government, but proved inadequate for post-war challenges. The weak central government lacked power to tax, regulate commerce, or enforce laws effectively. Economic problems, including debt, currency instability, and trade disputes between states, highlighted the need for stronger national authority. Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, 1786 to 1787, demonstrated the inability of the Confederation government to maintain domestic order and provided impetus for constitutional reform. The rebellion, led by debt-ridden farmers protesting tax policies and foreclosures, was suppressed by state militia, but revealed the fragility of the existing governmental system. The Constitutional Convention, convening in Philadelphia in May 1787, brought together 55 delegates to address the Article's deficiencies. The convention exceeded its mandate by drafting an entirely new constitution, rather than merely revising the existing framework. Key compromises included the Great Compromise establishing bicameral representation, the Three-Fifths Compromise addressing slavery and representation, and the creation of a federal system balancing national and state authority. The ratification debate of 1787 to 1788 featured intense discussion between Federalists supporting the Constitution and anti-Federalists opposing it. The Federalist Papers, written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, provided sophisticated arguments for ratification and remain influential in constitutional interpretation. Anti-Federalist concerns about individual rights led to promises for a Bill of Rights, ultimately fulfilled with the first 10 amendments.
Part 2. Early Republic and Antebellum Expansion, 1789 to 1860.
Establishing the new government. The implementation of the Constitution under George Washington's presidency, 1789 to 1797, established crucial precedents for American governance. Washington's administration faced the challenge of creating functioning governmental institutions while maintaining the delicate balance between federal authority and state rights. The creation of executive departments, the federal judiciary through the Judiciary Act of 1789, and the establishment of a national capital demonstrated the practical application of constitutional principles. Alexander Hamilton's financial program as Secretary of the Treasury addressed the new nation's economic challenges through assumption of state debts, establishment of a national bank, and implementation of protective tariffs. These policies sparked the first major political divisions in American history, with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison opposing what they viewed as excessive federal power and favoritism toward commercial interests over agricultural ones. The emergence of political parties, despite the founders' intentions to avoid factionalism, reflected fundamental disagreements about the Constitution's interpretation and the nation's future direction. The Federalist Party, led by Hamilton and John Adams, favored strong federal government, commercial development, and pro-British foreign policy. The Democratic-Republican Party, organized by Jefferson and Madison, advocated strict constitutional interpretation, agricultural interests, and sympathy for revolutionary France. Foreign policy challenges and partisan development. Foreign policy issues dominated much of the early Republic period, as European wars following the French Revolution created difficult choices for American leaders. Washington's Neutrality Proclamation of 1793 established the principle of avoiding European conflicts, but partisan divisions over foreign policy intensified domestic political competition. The Jay Treaty of 1794 with Britain resolved some outstanding issues from the Revolutionary War, but generated intense partisan controversy. Democratic Republicans viewed the treaty as too favorable to Britain and insufficiently supportive of France, while Federalists argued it preserved peace and promoted commerce. The treaty debate contributed to the crystallization of party opposition and demonstrated the impact of foreign policy on domestic politics. The quasi-war with France, 1798 to 1800, during John Adams's presidency, tested American neutrality and party unity. The XYZ affair, involving French demands for bribes from American diplomats, generated anti-French sentiment and strengthened Federalist positions. However, the Alien and Sedition Acts, passed by the Federalist Congress in 1798, created controversy by restricting immigration and limiting criticism of the government, leading to the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions asserting state rights to nullify federal laws. Jeffersonian democracy and westward expansion. Thomas Jefferson's election in 1800 marked what he called the Revolution of 1800, representing the first peaceful transfer of power between opposing political parties in American history. Jefferson's presidency, 1801 to 1809, emphasized limited federal government, strict constitutional interpretation, and agrarian values, though practical governance often required flexibility in applying these principles. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 doubled the nation's territory and raised important constitutional questions about federal power to acquire new territory. Jefferson, despite his strict constructionist views, concluded the purchase served national interests sufficiently to justify broad constitutional interpretation. The acquisition opened vast territories for westward expansion and secured control of the Mississippi River for American commerce. The Lewis and Clark Expedition, 1804 to 1806, exemplified Jefferson's commitment to scientific inquiry and Western exploration while gathering crucial information about the Louisiana Territory. The expedition's scientific and geographic discoveries, along with establishment of relations with Western Native American tribes, facilitated future westward movement and enhanced understanding of the continent's scope and resources. War of 1812 and National Identity. The War of 1812, sometimes called the Second War of Independence, resulted from ongoing tensions with Britain over maritime rights, impressment of American sailors, and British support for Native American resistance to American expansion. The war tested American nationalism and governmental effectiveness while highlighting sectional divisions, particularly New England opposition expressed through the Hartford Convention. The war's conduct revealed both American military weaknesses and sources of strength. Early disasters, including the burning of Washington, D.C., demonstrated military unpreparedness, while victories at Baltimore, Plattsburgh, and New Orleans bolstered national confidence. Andrew Jackson's victory at New Orleans, fought after the peace treaty was signed but before news reached America, made Jackson a national hero and symbol of American fighting spirit. The Treaty of Ghent, 1814, essentially restored pre-war boundaries and conditions, but the war's conclusion coincided with enhanced American nationalism and the decline of Federalist opposition. The Hartford Convention's perceived disloyalty during wartime effectively ended the Federalist Party as a national force, ushering in the era of good feelings under James Monroe's presidency. Economic development and the market revolution. The period following the War of 1812 witnessed significant economic transformation known as the Market Revolution. Improvements in transportation, particularly the Erie Canal's completion in 1825, connected eastern markets with western agricultural production and stimulated commercial development throughout the nation. The canal's success sparked extensive canal construction and demonstrated the potential for internal improvements to promote economic growth. The development of the factory system, beginning with textile manufacturing in New England, transformed production methods and social relations. The Lowell system employed young women in factory work under paternalistic supervision, representing an early form of industrial labor organization. However, working conditions often deteriorated as competition intensified and profit margins compressed. The expansion of slavery into new territories became increasingly contentious as economic development proceeded. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 temporarily resolved the crisis by admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, while prohibiting slavery in Louisiana Territory north of 36°30. Thomas Jefferson's observation that the Missouri crisis alarmed him like a fire bell in the night proved prophetic of future sectional conflicts. Jacksonian democracy and political transformation. Andrew Jackson's presidency, 1829 to 1837, marked a significant expansion of democratic participation and transformation of American political culture. Jackson's appeal to common citizens and opposition to privileged elites resonated with an increasingly egalitarian society, while his strong executive leadership redefined presidential power and its relationship to popular will. The Bank War of the 1830s exemplified Jacksonian principles and political methods. Jackson's opposition to the Second Bank of the United States as a corrupt monopoly serving wealthy interests against common citizens led to his veto of the bank's recharter bill and subsequent withdrawal of federal deposits. The bank's eventual demise contributed to financial instability, but demonstrated Jackson's commitment to limiting special privileges. The nullification crisis of 1832-1833 tested the limits of federal authority and state rights. South Carolina's attempt to nullify federal tariffs prompted Jackson's forceful response, asserting federal supremacy while seeking compromise through tariff reduction. The crisis foreshadowed future sectional conflicts while establishing precedents for federal enforcement of national law. Reform movements and social transformation. The antebellum period witnessed numerous reform movements, reflecting both religious revival and secular humanitarian impulses. The Second Great Awakening, beginning in the early 19th century, emphasized individual salvation and social improvement, inspiring various reform causes including temperance, education, and women's rights. The abolition movement evolved from gradual emancipation advocacy to immediate abolition demands. William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, beginning publication in 1831, advocated immediate emancipation and moral suasion to end slavery. The American Anti-Slavery Society, founded in 1833, organized petition campaigns and lecture tours to spread abolitionist messages, while the Underground Railroad provided practical assistance to escaping slaves. Women's rights advocacy emerged partly from women's participation in abolition and other reform movements. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, marked the beginning of organized women's rights activism in America. The convention's Declaration of Sentiments, modeled on the Declaration of Independence, articulated demands for women's political and social equality. Manifest destiny and territorial expansion. The concept of manifest destiny, articulated in the 1840s, provided ideological justification for American continental expansion. The belief that American expansion across the continent was both inevitable and divinely ordained influenced policy decisions and popular attitudes toward territorial acquisition and Native American displacement. The Texas annexation controversy of the 1840s raised questions about the expansion of slavery and sectional balance. Texas independence from Mexico in 1836 was followed by nearly a decade of diplomatic maneuvering before annexation in 1845. The annexation resolution's provision for potential division into multiple states reflected concerns about slavery's expansion and political representation. The Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, resulted from territorial disputes following Texas annexation and American desires for California and New Mexico. The war's successful conclusion through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo added vast western territories to the United States, but intensified debates over slavery's expansion into new territories. Sectional crisis and compromise attempts. The acquisition of Mexican territories renewed sectional tensions over slavery's expansion. The Wilmot Proviso, proposing to prohibit slavery in territories acquired from Mexico, passed the House of Representatives multiple times, but failed in the Senate, highlighting the sectional division of American politics. The Compromise of 1850, engineered by Henry Clay and Stephen Douglas, attempted to resolve territorial and slavery questions through a series of measures, including California's admission as a free state, the Fugitive Slave Act's strengthening, and popular sovereignty in Utah and New Mexico territories. The compromise temporarily reduced sectional tensions, but satisfied neither extreme abolitionists nor pro-slavery advocates. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise by allowing popular sovereignty to determine slavery's status in Kansas and Nebraska territories. The act's passage led to violent conflict in Bleeding, Kansas, and contributed to the Republican Party's formation as a specifically anti-slavery expansion political organization, setting the stage for intensified sectional conflict.
Part 3. Civil War Era and Reconstruction, 1860 to 1877.
The sectional crisis reaches breaking point. The election of 1860 crystallized the sectional divisions that had been building throughout the antebellum period. The Democratic Party split along sectional lines, with Northern Democrats nominating Stephen Douglas on a popular sovereignty platform, while Southern Democrats chose John C. Breckinridge as a pro-slavery candidate. The Constitutional Union Party, led by John Bell, attempted to avoid the slavery issue entirely by emphasizing preservation of the Union. Abraham Lincoln's victory with the Republican Party, despite receiving less than 40% of the popular vote, triggered the secession crisis. Lincoln's platform opposed slavery's expansion into new territories, while promising not to interfere with slavery where it already existed. However, Southern leaders viewed Republican victory as an existential threat to their social and economic system based on slave labor. South Carolina's secession on December 20, 1860, began the dissolution of the Union as 6 additional Deep South states, followed by February 1861. The formation of the Confederate States of America in Montgomery, Alabama, with Jefferson Davis as president, established a rival government claiming legitimacy based on states' rights and constitutional interpretation. The failure of compromise and outbreak of war. Various compromise efforts during the secession winter of 1860 to 1861 failed to resolve the crisis. The Crittenden Compromise proposed constitutional amendments protecting slavery where it existed and extending the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific. But Republicans rejected any compromise that would permit slavery's expansion. The Peace Conference of 1861, convened by Virginia, similarly failed to produce acceptable solutions. Lincoln's inaugural address on March 4, 1861, attempted to reassure the South while maintaining federal authority. He pledged not to interfere with slavery where it existed, but insisted that the Union was perpetual and that he would hold, occupy, and possess federal property in seceded states. The speech reflected Lincoln's hope for peaceful resolution while establishing his constitutional duty to preserve the Union. The attack on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, marked the beginning of armed conflict. The Confederate bombardment of the federal fort in Charleston Harbor provided Lincoln with a clear case of Southern aggression, while avoiding the appearance of Northern provocation. Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion prompted 4 additional states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, to join the Confederacy. Military strategy and early war conduct. The initial strategies of both sides reflected expectations of a relatively brief conflict. The Union's Anaconda Plan, developed by General Winfield Scott, proposed to blockade southern ports and control the Mississippi River to squeeze the Confederacy economically. Confederate strategy initially focused on defensive operations while seeking European recognition and intervention. The First Battle of Bull Run, Manassas, in July 1861, demonstrated that the war would be longer and more costly than initially anticipated. The Confederate victory shattered Northern expectations of quick triumph and led to more serious military preparation. The battle also established patterns of Confederate tactical superiority, offset by Union advantages in resources and manpower. The development of military leadership proved crucial to both sides' prospects. George B. McClellan's appointment as commanding general of Union forces brought organizational skills and training improvements, but also excessive caution that frustrated Lincoln's desire for aggressive action. Confederate generals Robert E. Lee and Thomas Stonewall Jackson emerged as tactical innovators whose victories sustained Southern morale despite material disadvantages. Emancipation and war aims. The evolution of Union war aims from preserving the Union to ending slavery reflected both military necessity and moral conviction. Lincoln initially emphasized restoration of the Union to maintain support from border states and Northern Democrats who opposed abolition but supported Union preservation. However, the logic of war increasingly pointed toward emancipation as both a military strategy and moral imperative. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued preliminarily in September 1862 and finally on January 1, 1863, transformed the war's character by making abolition an explicit Union war aim. The proclamation freed slaves in rebellious states while leaving slavery intact in loyal border states, reflecting both constitutional constraints and military strategy. The measure helped prevent European intervention on behalf of the Confederacy while encouraging slave resistance in the South. The recruitment of African American soldiers provided crucial manpower for Union forces while demonstrating Black commitment to freedom and equality. Nearly 200,000 African Americans served in Union military forces, with many former slaves fighting for their own liberation and that of their families. Their service strengthened arguments for post-war civil rights and political participation. The war's turning points. The Battle of Gettysburg, July 1st, 3rd, 1863, marked the war's crucial turning point in the Eastern Theater. Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania represented the Confederacy's most ambitious offensive operation, but the defeat at Gettysburg effectively ended Confederate hopes for decisive victory. The battle's enormous casualties, over 50,000 combined, demonstrated the war's unprecedented destructiveness. The siege and capture of Vicksburg on July 4, 1863, gave the Union control of the Mississippi River and effectively split the Confederacy. Ulysses S. Grant's successful campaign demonstrated the strategic vision and operational skill that would later make him commanding general of all Union forces. The victory, coinciding with Gettysburg, marked the beginning of irreversible Union advantage. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, delivered at the dedication of the Battlefield Cemetery in November 1863, redefined the war's meaning in terms of democratic ideals and national purpose. The brief speech transformed the battlefield into a symbol of national rebirth and democratic dedication, providing enduring language for American civic identity. Total War and Confederate Collapse. Grant's appointment as commanding general in March 1864 brought a coordinated strategy designed to utilize Union numerical and material advantages. The simultaneous campaigns against Lee in Virginia and Joseph E. Johnston in Georgia maintained constant pressure on Confederate forces while preventing the concentration of Southern resources for defensive purposes. William T. Sherman's march to the sea through Georgia in late 1864 exemplified the Union's adoption of total war tactics designed to destroy the Confederacy's capacity and will to continue fighting. Sherman's forces systematically destroyed infrastructure, resources, and property while demonstrating Union power to Confederate civilians. The march's psychological impact matched its material destruction in undermining Confederate morale. The election of 1864 tested Northern commitment to continuing the war despite enormous casualties and costs. Lincoln's victory over George B. McClellan, running on a peace platform, demonstrated popular support for seeing the war through to complete victory. The election results convinced European observers that the Union would prevail and discouraged any remaining Confederate hopes for foreign intervention. Reconstruction planning and Lincoln's assassination. Lincoln's approach to Reconstruction emphasized rapid restoration of the Union with lenient terms for defeated Confederates. The 10% Plan, announced in December 1863, would restore state governments when 10% of 1860 voters took loyalty oaths and accepted emancipation. This lenient approach reflected Lincoln's desire to encourage Confederate surrender while maintaining post-war national unity. Congressional Republicans, led by the radical faction, favored more stringent Reconstruction requirements, including guarantees of African American civil rights and punishment of Confederate leaders. The Wade-Davis Bill of 1864, requiring majority loyalty oaths and prohibiting Confederate leaders from participating in new state governments, reflected congressional determination to reshape Southern society. Lincoln's assassination on April 14, 1865, just days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, profoundly affected Reconstruction's course. John Wilkes Booth's attack removed the leader most capable of managing the transition from war to peace while balancing demands for justice and reconciliation. Andrew Johnson's succession brought a different approach to Reconstruction that would generate intense conflict with Congress. Presidential Reconstruction under Johnson. Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction policies reflected his background as a poor white Southerner who opposed both slavery and the planter aristocracy. His plan for rapid restoration required new state governments to ratify the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery and repudiate Confederate debts, but otherwise imposed minimal requirements on former Confederate states. The Black Codes, enacted by Southern state governments during presidential Reconstruction, severely restricted African American freedom and economic opportunities. These laws, designed to maintain white supremacy and ensure labor control, effectively sought to recreate slavery's conditions under different legal forms. Northern outrage over the Black Codes contributed to Republican electoral victories in 1866. The emergence of the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist organizations demonstrated white Southern resistance to emancipation and black equality. Violence against African Americans and white Republicans attempted to restore white supremacy through intimidation and murder when legal means proved insufficient. The federal government's limited response encouraged further violence and resistance to Reconstruction. Congressional Reconstruction and the 14th Amendment. The Republican electoral triumph in the 1866 midterm elections provided a mandate for congressional Reconstruction policies that directly challenged Johnson's approach. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 divided the South into military districts under federal oversight and required new state constitutions guaranteeing African American voting rights before readmission to the Union. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, fundamentally altered the Constitution's relationship between federal and state governments while establishing principles of birthright citizenship and equal protection. The amendment's provisions regarding citizenship, due process, and equal protection would become central to future civil rights struggles, though their immediate impact was limited by narrow judicial interpretation. Johnson's impeachment in 1868 reflected the constitutional crisis created by executive-legislative conflict over Reconstruction policy. The House impeachment and narrow Senate acquittal, by one vote, established precedents for presidential accountability while demonstrating the limits of congressional power to remove presidents for political disagreements rather than clear legal violations. The end of Reconstruction. The election of Ulysses S. Grant in 1868 brought a war hero to the presidency, but failed to resolve Reconstruction's fundamental problems. Grant's administration, while committed to protecting African American rights, faced increasing Northern fatigue with Southern intervention and growing opposition to federal civil rights enforcement. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, prohibited voting discrimination based on race, but left other barriers to African American political participation intact. The amendment's limitations, including failure to address literacy tests, poll taxes, and other discriminatory practices, would enable future disenfranchisement efforts once federal enforcement ended. The Compromise of 1877, resolving the disputed presidential election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel J. Tilden, effectively ended Reconstruction by withdrawing federal troops from the South. The compromise gave Hayes the presidency in exchange for ending federal intervention in Southern politics, abandoning African Americans to white supremacist control, and ushering in the era of Jim Crow segregation.
Part 4. Industrial Transformation and Progressive Era, 1877 to 1920.
The Gilded Age and Industrial Revolution. The period following Reconstruction witnessed unprecedented industrial expansion that transformed American society, economy, and culture. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 symbolized the technological achievement and national integration that characterized the era, while massive immigration provided the labor force necessary for industrial growth. Cities expanded rapidly as centers of manufacturing and commerce, creating new social conditions and challenges. The rise of big business and corporate capitalism fundamentally altered economic relationships and power structures. Entrepreneurs like Andrew Carnegie in steel, John D. Rockefeller in oil, and J.P. Morgan in finance built industrial empires that concentrated enormous wealth and economic power. These business leaders, dubbed robber barons by critics and captains of industry by supporters, utilized new corporate forms and financial instruments to achieve unprecedented scale and efficiency. The development of new technologies revolutionized production methods in daily life. The Bessemer process made steel production more efficient and affordable, enabling construction of skyscrapers and modern infrastructure. Thomas Edison's invention of the incandescent light bulb and development of electrical power systems transformed urban life, while Alexander Graham Bell's telephone revolutionized communication. These innovations created new industries and employment opportunities while reshaping social interactions. Labor and industrial conflict. The growth of industrial capitalism created new forms of labor organization and conflict as workers sought to improve wages, working conditions, and job security. The Knights of Labor, founded in 1869, attempted to organize all workers, regardless of skill level or occupation, into a single national organization. Their vision of producer cooperation and social reform represented an alternative to pure wage labor. But internal divisions and external opposition limited their effectiveness. The American Federation of Labor, established in 1886 under Samuel Gompers's leadership, represented a more pragmatic approach focusing on skilled workers and immediate economic gains rather than broader social transformation. The AFL's emphasis on pure and simple unionism avoided political radicalism, while building stable organizations capable of sustained collective bargaining with employers. Industrial conflict often turned violent as employers and workers struggled over the terms of employment. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 marked the first nationwide labor conflict, demonstrating both worker solidarity and the federal government's willingness to intervene on behalf of business interests. The Homestead Strike of 1892 and Pullman Strike of 1894 further illustrated the intensity of labor-capital conflict and the limitations of worker organization against combined business and government power. Agricultural transformation and rural protest. Agriculture underwent significant changes during the Gilded Age as mechanization, railroad transportation, and global markets transformed farming from subsistence to commercial production. The expansion of wheat production in the Great Plains, enabled by new plowing techniques and harvesting machinery, made American agriculture increasingly competitive in world markets, while subjecting farmers to price fluctuations beyond their control. The development of the cattle industry in the post-Civil War West created the iconic image of the American cowboy, while demonstrating the integration of Western resources into national and international markets. The long cattle drives from Texas to railroad terminals in Kansas epitomized the entrepreneurial spirit of Western development. Though the open-range system proved temporary as agricultural settlement and barbed wire fencing enclosed the prairie. Farmers faced significant economic challenges as production increased faster than demand, leading to chronic deflation and debt problems. The crop lien system in the post-war South trapped many farmers, both black and white, in cycles of debt and dependency while perpetuating agricultural poverty. Similar problems affected Western farmers who borrowed heavily to purchase land and equipment, but found themselves unable to service debts when agricultural prices declined. The Populist Movement. The Farmers' Alliance movement of the 1880s organized rural producers to address economic grievances through cooperative purchasing, marketing, and political action. The Alliance's sub-treasury plan proposed federal warehouses where farmers could store crops and receive loans against future sales, addressing the credit shortage that forced farmers to sell at harvest time when prices were lowest. The People's Party, formed in 1892, represented the political culmination of agrarian protest movements. The populist platform called for significant economic and political reforms, including free silver coinage to increase the money supply, government ownership of railroads and telegraph systems, and direct election of senators. These proposals challenged the dominant economic orthodoxy while advocating democratic reforms to increase popular control of government. The election of 1896 marked the climax of populist influence as Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan adopted free silver as his central issue. Bryan's Cross of Gold speech at the Democratic Convention provided powerful rhetoric for the silver cause, but his defeat by Republican William McKinley demonstrated the limitations of agrarian politics in an increasingly urban and industrial society. Immigration and urban life. Massive immigration from Europe transformed American demographics and culture between 1880 and 1920. Over 20 million immigrants arrived during this period, with increasing numbers coming from Southern and Eastern Europe rather than the Northwestern European sources of earlier immigration. This new immigration brought different languages, religions, and cultural traditions that challenged existing American social patterns. Urban growth accompanied industrial development as cities became centers of manufacturing, commerce, and cultural innovation. New York, Chicago, and other major cities expanded rapidly, creating new forms of urban architecture, transportation systems, and social organization. The development of steel frame construction enabled skyscrapers that symbolized American economic achievement, while electric streetcars and elevated railways facilitated urban expansion. Immigration and urbanization created new social tensions and reform movements. Nativism, expressed through organizations like the American Protective Association, reflected native-born Americans' fears about immigration's impact on wages, political control, and cultural unity. Settlement houses, led by reformers like Jane Addams at Hull House in Chicago, attempted to assist immigrant assimilation while preserving valuable cultural traditions. The progressive movement emerges. Progressive reform emerged in the 1890s as a response to industrialization's social and economic problems. Progressive reformers, drawn from middle-class backgrounds, sought to apply scientific methods and professional expertise to social problems while expanding democratic participation and governmental regulation of business practices. Municipal reform represented one of the earliest progressive achievements as reformers attacked urban political machines and corruption. The commission and city manager forms of government reflected progressive faith in expertise and efficiency over partisan politics. Reforms like civil service systems, competitive bidding for public contracts, and municipal ownership of utilities aimed to reduce corruption while improving public services. Social justice reforms addressed the human costs of industrialization, particularly the conditions facing women and children in industrial employment. The National Child Labor Committee, founded in 1904, campaigned against child labor through investigation, publicity, and legislative advocacy. The movement achieved significant success in establishing minimum age requirements and compulsory education laws, though enforcement remained problematic. Progressive reform under Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, 1901 to 1909, marked the first sustained federal involvement in progressive reform. Roosevelt's approach, which he called the Square Deal, emphasized regulation of big business, conservation of natural resources, and consumer protection. His willingness to use federal power to mediate between capital and labor represented a significant departure from previous presidential approaches to economic issues. Roosevelt's trust-busting campaign targeted business combinations that restrained trade or created monopolistic conditions. The Sherman Antitrust Act, largely ineffective since its passage in 1890, became a tool for federal regulation under Roosevelt's vigorous enforcement. High-profile cases against Northern Securities Company and Standard Oil demonstrated federal determination to control corporate power, though Roosevelt distinguished between good and bad trusts based on their behavior rather than size. Conservation emerged as a major progressive cause under Roosevelt's leadership, reflecting concerns about resource depletion and environmental degradation. The establishment of national parks, forests, and wildlife refuges preserved natural areas for future generations while demonstrating federal responsibility for environmental stewardship. Gifford Pinchot's leadership of the Forest Service exemplified progressive faith in scientific management of natural resources. Progressive reform under Wilson. Woodrow Wilson's presidency, 1913 to 1921, brought a different approach to progressive reform, emphasizing restoration of economic competition rather than regulation of monopolies. Wilson's New Freedom program included significant legislative achievements in banking, antitrust policy, and labor relations that established lasting precedents for federal economic intervention. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 created a central banking system designed to provide monetary stability and credit flexibility while avoiding the concentration of financial power that had characterized previous banking arrangements. The system of 12 regional banks overseen by a Federal Reserve Board attempted to balance public and private interests while providing the elastic currency that financial panics had demonstrated was necessary for economic stability. The Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 strengthened federal antitrust policy by prohibiting specific practices like price discrimination and interlocking directorates that restricted competition. The act also exempted labor unions from antitrust prosecution, representing a significant victory for organized labor. The Federal Trade Commission, established the same year, provided ongoing regulatory oversight of business practices rather than relying solely on judicial enforcement. World War I and American neutrality. The outbreak of World War I in Europe in August 1914 presented significant challenges for American foreign policy and domestic unity. Wilson's initial proclamation of neutrality reflected both traditional American isolationism and the practical difficulties of maintaining unity in a nation with substantial immigrant populations tied to various European countries. However, maintaining neutrality proved increasingly difficult as the war's scope and intensity exceeded all precedents. German submarine warfare posed the greatest threat to American neutrality as U-boat attacks on merchant shipping violated traditional neutral rights and endangered American lives. The sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915, killing over 1,100 passengers, including 128 Americans, generated intense controversy and anti-German sentiment. Wilson's diplomatic protests eventually led to German restrictions on submarine warfare, but the issue remained a source of tension. Economic ties to the Allied powers gradually compromised American neutrality as trade and lending created significant financial interests in Allied victory. American bankers, led by J.P. Morgan and Company, provided massive loans to Britain and France, while trade with the Allies expanded dramatically. These economic connections made American prosperity increasingly dependent on Allied success, undermining the practical basis for continued neutrality. American entry into World War I. Wilson's decision to seek a declaration of war in April 1917 reflected the breakdown of diplomatic alternatives and his conclusion that German actions threatened American interests and values. The resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare in early 1917 violated previous German commitments, while the Zimmermann Telegram's proposal for a German-Mexican alliance against the United States provided clear evidence of German hostility. Wilson's war message to Congress on April 2, 1917, framed American participation in idealistic terms as a crusade to make the world safe for democracy. This rhetorical approach reflected Wilson's belief that American involvement required moral justification beyond mere defense of material interests. The Congressional Declaration of War on April 6 marked America's entry into the conflict that would transform its role in world affairs. Mobilization for war. American mobilization for World War I required unprecedented government coordination of economic resources and social organization. The War Industries Board, led by Bernard Baruch, coordinated industrial production for military needs while demonstrating the potential for centralized economic planning. Similar agencies managed food production, fuel allocation, and transportation to maximize efficiency and support the war effort. The Selective Service Act of 1917 established conscription to build American military forces, registering over 24 million men and drafting nearly 3 million for military service. The draft represented a significant expansion of federal authority over individual citizens while ensuring adequate manpower for American military commitments. Local draft boards attempted to balance military needs with essential civilian production and family responsibilities. Financing the war required new approaches to federal revenue and borrowing that permanently expanded government fiscal capacity. The Revenue Acts of 1917 and 1918 dramatically increased income tax rates and established excess profits taxes on corporations, making the federal income tax a major revenue source for the first time. Liberty Bond drives mobilized civilian financial support while creating emotional investment in war aims through mass participation in government financing. Wartime social changes. World War I accelerated social changes that had been developing during the Progressive Era while creating new opportunities and tensions. The Great Migration of African Americans from the South to northern industrial cities intensified as war production created labor demand and reduced European immigration. This population movement had lasting consequences for American racial geography and civil rights development. Women's participation in the war effort, both through employment in traditionally male occupations and through volunteer activities, strengthened arguments for women's suffrage. The National American Woman Suffrage Association, led by Carrie Chapman Catt, successfully linked women's war contributions to their claims for political equality. The 19th Amendment, passed by Congress in 1919 and ratified in 1920, represented the culmination of decades of suffrage activism. Wartime repression and civil liberties. The war's demands created pressures for national unity that resulted in significant restrictions on civil liberties and democratic dissent. The Espionage Act of 1917 and Sedition Act of 1918 criminalized various forms of opposition to the war effort, leading to prosecution of socialists, pacifists, and other dissidents. These laws reflected wartime fears about disloyalty and subversion, while establishing precedents for restrictions on free speech during national emergencies. The Committee on Public Information, led by George Creel, coordinated government propaganda efforts to maintain civilian morale and support for war aims. The committee's activities, including the famous 4-Minute Men speakers program, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of mass communication while raising questions about government manipulation of public opinion in democratic societies. Anti-German sentiment reached extreme levels as communities banned German language instruction, renamed German-American institutions, and sometimes engaged in vigilante violence against German Americans. This wartime hysteria reflected broader anxieties about immigration and national identity, while demonstrating the fragility of civil liberties during periods of national stress. The Red Scare. The end of World War I coincided with the Russian Revolution and fears of radical revolution spreading to the United States. The Red Scare of 1910-1920 reflected anxieties about labor unrest, immigration, and political radicalism that had been intensified by wartime experiences. A series of strikes in 1919, including the Seattle General Strike and Boston Police Strike, generated fears of revolutionary activity despite their primarily economic motivations. The Palmer Raids, conducted by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer in 1919 to 1920, resulted in the arrest and deportation of thousands of suspected radicals, many of whom were foreign-born. These actions violated basic constitutional rights while reflecting the intensity of anti-radical sentiment in the immediate post-war period. The raid's eventual discrediting contributed to Palmer's political downfall and a reaction against wartime repression. The Sacco and Vanzetti case became a symbol of post-war anti-radical hysteria and ethnic prejudice. The conviction and execution of 2 Italian anarchists for robbery and murder, despite questionable evidence, reflected broader prejudices against immigrants and radicals. The case generated international attention and lasting controversy about American justice and civil liberties.
Part 5. Modern America. From New Deal to Global Superpower. 1920 present.
The Roaring Twenties and Cultural Transformation. The decade of the 1920s marked a period of significant cultural, economic, and social transformation that established patterns of modern American life. Economic prosperity, driven by new consumer industries like automobiles and radio, created unprecedented opportunities for leisure and consumption among middle-class Americans. The automobile revolution, symbolized by Henry Ford's assembly line production methods and the Model T's affordability, transformed American geography, social relationships, and economic patterns. Urban culture flourished during the 1920s as cities became centers of cultural innovation and social experimentation. The Harlem Renaissance represented a flowering of African-American literary, artistic, and musical achievement that challenged racist stereotypes while creating new forms of cultural expression. Writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, musicians like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington, and artists like Aaron Douglas contributed to a cultural renaissance that had national and international influence. The emergence of mass consumer culture, facilitated by advertising, installment buying, and mass production, fundamentally altered American social relationships and values. Radio broadcasting created the first truly national mass medium, enabling simultaneous shared experiences across geographic and social boundaries. The motion picture industry, centered in Hollywood, created new forms of entertainment while shaping national cultural standards and aspirations. Social tensions and cultural conflicts. The prosperity and cultural innovation of the 1920s generated significant social tensions and political conflicts that reflected deeper disagreements about American identity and values. The revival of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, with membership reaching several million, demonstrated the persistence of racial, religious, and ethnic prejudices despite economic prosperity. The Klan's influence extended beyond the South to northern and western communities, where immigration and urbanization had created social tensions. Prohibition, established by the 18th Amendment in 1920, represented an attempt to legislate moral behavior that ultimately proved unenforceable and counterproductive. The widespread violation of prohibition laws, the growth of organized crime, and the corruption of law enforcement officials demonstrated the limitations of using federal power to regulate personal behavior. The policy's failure contributed to its repeal through the 21st Amendment in 1933. The Scopes Trial of 1925 symbolized the conflict between traditional religious values and modern scientific understanding. The prosecution of John Scopes for teaching evolution in Tennessee attracted national attention and highlighted divisions between urban and rural America, scientific and religious worldviews, and traditional and modern values. While Scopes was convicted, the trial's coverage generally portrayed anti-evolution forces as backward and intolerant. Economic boom and financial speculation. The economic expansion of the 1920s was characterized by significant increases in industrial production, corporate profits, and stock market values. New industries like automobiles, radio, and aviation created substantial wealth while transforming daily life. The development of consumer credit allowed middle-class Americans to purchase automobiles, appliances, and other goods that previously would have been unaffordable, stimulating demand and economic growth. Financial speculation reached unprecedented levels during the later 1920s as stock prices rose far beyond the underlying value of corporate assets and earnings. The practice of buying stocks on margin, with as little as 10% down payment, enabled small investors to participate in the market while creating enormous potential for losses if prices declined. Banking practices that combined commercial and investment banking functions created conflicts of interest and systemic risks. The Federal Reserve's monetary policies during the 1920s failed to prevent the development of speculative bubbles while maintaining the gold standard's constraints on money supply expansion. Easy credit policies early in the decade contributed to speculation, while later attempts to restrain speculation through higher interest rates may have contributed to the eventual economic collapse. The Great Depression. The stock market crash of October 1929 marked the beginning of the most severe economic depression in American history. The crash wiped out billions of dollars in paper wealth and destroyed confidence in the financial system. But the depression's depth and duration resulted from more fundamental economic problems, including income inequality, structural imbalances in the economy, and policy mistakes by government officials. Bank failures cascaded throughout the financial system as depositor runs forced banks to call in loans and liquidate assets at depressed prices. The absence of federal deposit insurance meant that bank failures wiped out depositor savings, further reducing consumer spending and business investment. By 1933, nearly one-third of all banks had failed, and the surviving institutions were extremely cautious about lending. Unemployment reached approximately 25% of the workforce by 1933, with even higher rates in industrial cities and among minority populations. The absence of unemployment insurance or other social safety nets meant that job loss often led to complete destitution. Homelessness increased dramatically as people lost their homes and formed shantytowns known as Hoovervilles after President Herbert Hoover, who was widely blamed for the Depression's severity. Hoover's response and limitations. President Herbert Hoover's response to the Depression reflected his philosophy of limited government and faith in voluntary cooperation between business and government to restore prosperity. Hoover established agencies like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to provide loans to banks and businesses, but he opposed direct federal relief to unemployed individuals, believing that such assistance would undermine individual initiative and local responsibility. Hoover's belief that the Depression was primarily a psychological phenomenon that would end once confidence returned proved disastrously wrong as the economic collapse deepened and prolonged unemployment created genuine hardship for millions of Americans. His administration's emphasis on maintaining balanced budgets and orthodox financial policies provided inadequate stimulus for economic recovery. The bonus March of 1932, when World War I veterans demanded early payment of promised bonuses, symbolized the growing desperation of Depression victims and Hoover's political weakness. The violent dispersal of the marchers by federal troops under General Douglas MacArthur created powerful images of government callousness towards suffering citizens and contributed to Hoover's decisive electoral defeat in 1932. Roosevelt and the New Deal. Franklin D. Roosevelt's election in 1932 brought a dramatically different approach to addressing the Depression based on active federal intervention in the economy and direct assistance to unemployed and impoverished Americans. Roosevelt's inaugural address, with its famous assertion that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, projected confidence and determination while promising vigorous action to address the crisis. The first 100 days of Roosevelt's presidency witnessed unprecedented legislative activity as Congress passed major bills addressing banking, agriculture, industry, and unemployment. The Emergency Banking Act restored confidence in the financial system by closing and inspecting banks before allowing them to reopen. The Civilian Conservation Corps provided employment for young men in conservation projects, while the Federal Emergency Relief Administration provided direct assistance to unemployed families. The National Industrial Recovery Act attempted to stabilize industrial production and employment through industry-wide codes that regulated prices, wages, and working conditions. While the act was later declared unconstitutional, it represented an ambitious attempt to coordinate economic activity and demonstrated Roosevelt's willingness to experiment with new approaches to economic management. New Deal programs and agencies. The second phase of the New Deal, beginning in 1935, focused on more permanent reforms and Social Security measures. The Works Progress Administration, led by Harry Hopkins, provided employment for millions of Americans in construction, arts, and other projects. The WPA's programs not only provided income for unemployed workers, but also created lasting improvements in infrastructure, public buildings, and cultural institutions. The Social Security Act of 1935 established the foundation of the American welfare state by providing old age pensions, unemployment insurance, and assistance for dependent children and disabled individuals. The act represented a fundamental shift in federal responsibility for individual welfare while creating a system that combined insurance principles with redistributive elements. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935, also known as the Wagner Act, guaranteed workers' rights to organize unions and engage in collective bargaining. The Act's passage led to dramatic increases in union membership and industrial conflicts as workers sought to exercise their newly protected rights. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, formed in 1935, organized mass production workers who had been excluded from traditional craft unions. Opposition to the New Deal. Roosevelt's policies generated significant opposition from business leaders, conservative politicians, and the Supreme Court, who argued that New Deal programs exceeded constitutional limits on federal power and threatened free enterprise. The Supreme Court's invalidation of key New Deal measures, including the National Industrial Recovery Act and Agricultural Adjustment Act, created a constitutional crisis that led to Roosevelt's controversial court-packing plan. Roosevelt's proposal to expand the Supreme Court by adding up to 6 additional justices generated intense political controversy and opposition even from supporters of New Deal policies. While the plan failed, the court subsequently upheld New Deal legislation, leading to claims that Roosevelt had achieved his objective through political pressure rather than constitutional change. Conservative opposition to the New Deal crystallized around concerns about growing federal power, deficit spending, and threats to traditional business prerogatives. The American Liberty League, formed by conservative Democrats and Republicans, argued that New Deal policies undermined constitutional government and individual freedom. However, Roosevelt's continued electoral success demonstrated popular support for active government intervention in economic affairs. World War II and American involvement. The outbreak of World War II in Europe in September 1939 gradually drew the United States away from neutrality toward active involvement in the conflict. Roosevelt's sympathies clearly lay with Britain and France, but strong isolationist sentiment, embodied in the America First Committee, opposed American involvement in European conflicts. The Neutrality Acts of the 1930s reflected congressional determination to avoid the mistakes that had led to World War I involvement. The fall of France in June 1940 dramatically altered American perceptions of the war's significance and the threat to American security. Roosevelt's destroyer for bases deal with Britain in September 1940 marked a significant departure from neutrality, while the Lend-Lease Act of March 1941 provided massive military assistance to countries fighting the Axis powers. These measures reflected Roosevelt's conclusion that American security required Allied victory. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, ended the debate over American involvement by providing clear justification for war. Roosevelt's characterization of December 7th as a date which will live in infamy captured the national outrage that unified Americans behind the war effort. Congress declared war with only one dissenting vote, demonstrating the dramatic shift in public opinion. Wartime mobilization and the home front. American mobilization for World War II achieved unprecedented coordination of economic resources for military purposes while demonstrating the potential for government planning and direction of economic activity. The War Production Board coordinated industrial conversion from civilian to military production, while agencies like the Office of Price Administration managed rationing and price controls to prevent inflation. The mobilization effort ended the Great Depression by creating full employment and generating enormous demand for industrial products. Defense spending increased from less than 2% of gross domestic product in 1940 to over 40% by 1944, while unemployment fell to less than 2%. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, symbolized by the Rosie the Riveter image, while African Americans gained access to industrial employment through the Fair Employment Practices Committee. Financing the war required massive increases in federal spending and taxation that permanently expanded the federal government's fiscal capacity. The Revenue Acts of 1942 and 1943 made the federal income tax a mass tax for the first time by dramatically lowering exemption levels and increasing rates. War bond drives mobilized civilian savings for government financing while maintaining emotional investment in war aims. Wartime social changes and tensions. World War II accelerated social changes that had been developing since the Progressive Era, while creating new opportunities and tensions. The Second Great Migration of African Americans from the South to industrial centers intensified as defense production created labor demand. However, racial tensions persisted, exemplified by the Detroit race riot of 1943 and conflicts over housing and employment in other cities. The internment of Japanese Americans, authorized by Executive Order 9066 in February 1942, represented one of the most serious violations of civil liberties in American history. The relocation of over 100,000 people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast to internment camps reflected wartime hysteria and racial prejudice rather than genuine security concerns. The policy's later recognition as a grave injustice led to formal apologies and reparations in the 1980s. Women's expanded roles in wartime production and military service challenged traditional gender roles while demonstrating women's capabilities in previously male-dominated occupations. However, the expectation that women would return to domestic roles after the war created tensions that would influence post-war social development and contribute to later feminist movements. The Cold War begins. The end of World War II marked the beginning of the Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union, transforming American foreign policy and domestic politics for the next 4 decades. The breakdown of wartime cooperation reflected fundamental disagreements about post-war arrangements in Europe and the nature of international order. The Truman Doctrine of 1947 committed the United States to supporting free peoples against communist expansion, while the Marshall Plan provided massive economic assistance for European recovery. The Korean War, 1950-1953, represented the first major military conflict of the Cold War era and established patterns of limited war that would characterize subsequent conflicts. President Truman's decision to intervene in Korea without congressional declaration of war expanded presidential authority in foreign affairs while demonstrating American commitment to containing communist expansion. The war's inconclusive outcome and General MacArthur's dismissal highlighted the tensions between military objectives and political constraints in Cold War conflicts. Domestic anti-communism reached extreme levels during the early Cold War period, affecting American politics, culture, and civil liberties. Senator Joseph McCarthy's accusations of communist infiltration in government, while largely unfounded, reflected genuine concerns about national security and loyalty. The anti-communist hysteria of the McCarthy era damaged American intellectual life and political discourse while demonstrating the fragility of civil liberties during periods of national anxiety. Post-war prosperity and suburban growth. The post-war period witnessed unprecedented economic prosperity that transformed American society and created new patterns of residential and social organization. The GI Bill provided veterans with educational opportunities and housing assistance that facilitated middle-class expansion and suburban development. Federal highway construction and mortgage policies encouraged suburban growth while contributing to urban decline and racial segregation. The development of television as a mass medium created new forms of national culture while shaping political communication and social attitudes. Television programming reinforced traditional family values and consumer aspirations while providing shared cultural experiences that transcended regional and social boundaries. the medium's power became evident in political campaigns and social movements of the following decades. Consumer culture reached new heights during the 1950s as Americans enjoyed rising incomes and expanding leisure time. The proliferation of automobiles, appliances, and other consumer goods reflected both technological advancement and changing social values that emphasized individual fulfillment and material success. However, critics like David Reisman and William H. White questioned whether prosperity was producing conformity and social emptiness. The Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 1960s challenged the system of racial segregation and discrimination that had persisted since Reconstruction, while demonstrating the potential for nonviolent social change. The Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional, overturning the separate but equal doctrine established in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. The Montgomery bus boycott, 1955 to 1956, sparked by Rosa Parks's arrest for refusing to give up her bus seat, demonstrated the effectiveness of economic pressure and nonviolent resistance in challenging segregation. Martin Luther King Jr.'s leadership of the boycott established him as a national civil rights leader while showcasing the power of organized mass action guided by principles of nonviolence and Christian love. The sit-in movement, beginning with 4 college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, in February 1960, energized younger civil rights activists while developing new tactics for challenging segregation. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, formed in 1960, provided organization for student activism while maintaining independence from established civil rights organizations. The Freedom Rides of 1961 tested federal enforcement of interstate transportation desegregation while generating national attention through violent responses by segregationists. The Great Society and Liberal Reform. Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency, 1963 to 1969, witnessed the most extensive expansion of federal social programs since the New Deal through initiatives collectively known as the Great Society. The Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 launched the war on poverty through programs like Head Start, Job Corps, and Community Action that aimed to break the cycle of poverty through education, training, and community organization. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination in public accommodations, employment, and federally funded programs while establishing enforcement mechanisms that gave the federal government significant power to combat racial discrimination. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 eliminated literacy tests and other barriers to African American political participation while providing for federal oversight of elections in areas with histories of discrimination. Medicare and Medicaid, established in 1965, provided health insurance for elderly and poor Americans while demonstrating federal commitment to addressing social needs through government programs. These programs represented significant expansions of the welfare state that reflected both moral commitments and political calculations about maintaining middle-class support for social programs. The Vietnam War. American involvement in Vietnam escalated gradually from advisory support in the 1950s to major combat commitment by the mid-1960s. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution of 1964 provided congressional authorization for expanded military action following reported attacks on American naval vessels. However, the resolution's broad language gave President Johnson extensive authority to conduct military operations without further congressional approval. The escalation of American involvement in Vietnam reflected Cold War assumptions about the need to contain communist expansion while demonstrating the limitations of military power in achieving political objectives. The commitment of over 500,000 American troops by 1968 failed to defeat North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces while generating increasing domestic opposition to the war. The Tet Offensive of January 1968, while a military defeat for North Vietnamese forces, proved a political victory by demonstrating the enemy's continued capacity for major operations and undermining official optimism about the war's progress. The offensive's impact on American public opinion contributed to President Johnson's decision not to seek re-election and marked the beginning of American disengagement from Vietnam. Social and cultural revolution of the 1960s. The 1960s witnessed unprecedented challenges to traditional authority and social arrangements as various groups demanded recognition, rights, and cultural change. The counterculture movement, centered on youth rejection of conventional values and lifestyle, expressed opposition to the Vietnam War, racial discrimination, and materialistic culture through alternative lifestyles, music, and political activism. The women's liberation movement emerged in the late 1960s as women challenged traditional gender roles and demanded equal rights in employment, education, and political participation. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, 1963, articulated many women's dissatisfaction with domestic roles, while organizations like the National Organization for Women fought for legal and political equality. The movement's impact extended far beyond legal changes to reshape social expectations and personal relationships. The environmental movement gained momentum during the 1960s as concerns about pollution, resource depletion, and ecological destruction captured public attention. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, 1962, raised awareness about pesticide dangers, while events like the Santa Barbara oil spill of 1969 demonstrated environmental threats. The first Earth Day in 1970 mobilized mass participation in environmental activism and led to significant legislation, including the Clean Air Act and Environmental Protection Agency creation. Conservative resurgence and political realignment. The social upheavals of the 1960s generated conservative backlash that reshaped American politics for subsequent decades. Richard Nixon's election in 1968 reflected the appeal of law and order themes to voters concerned about social disorder and anti-war protests. Nixon's Southern strategy successfully attracted white Southern voters away from the Democratic Party by appealing to racial anxieties and opposition to federal civil rights enforcement. The rise of the religious right as a political force beginning in the 1970s reflected evangelical Protestant opposition to secular culture and liberal social policies. Organizations like the Moral Majority, founded by Jerry Falwell in 1979, mobilized religious conservatives around issues like abortion, school prayer, and traditional family values while providing crucial support for conservative political candidates. Ronald Reagan's election in 1980 represented the triumph of conservative ideology that emphasized limited government, free market economics, and traditional values. Reagan's presidency marked a significant shift in American political discourse away from New Deal liberalism toward conservative principles that questioned government's capacity to solve social problems while celebrating individual initiative and private enterprise. End of the Cold War and New World Order. The collapse of the Soviet Union and end of the Cold War between 1989 and 1991 fundamentally altered international relations and America's role in world affairs. The United States emerged as the world's sole superpower while facing new challenges including regional conflicts, terrorism, and economic competition from allies rather than military threats from ideological rivals. The Persian Gulf War of 1991 demonstrated American military technological superiority while establishing precedents for post-Cold War military intervention. The war's quick victory and limited casualties contrasted sharply with the Vietnam experience while showing American capacity for projecting power globally in defense of interests and allies. Contemporary challenges and political polarization. The terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, marked a watershed in American history comparable to Pearl Harbor in their impact on national consciousness and policy priorities. The attacks killed nearly 3,000 people and demonstrated American vulnerability to asymmetric threats while generating support for expanded government surveillance powers and military interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq. The War on Terror, initiated by President George W. Bush, reshaped American foreign policy and domestic security arrangements while raising questions about civil liberties and constitutional limits on executive power. The invasions of Afghanistan, 2001, and Iraq, 2003, reflected American determination to eliminate terrorist havens and prevent proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, though the Iraq War's justifications proved controversial when anticipated weapons were not found. The financial crisis of 2008, triggered by subprime mortgage defaults and risky financial practices, demonstrated the continued vulnerability of market economies to speculation and regulatory failure. The crisis's severity, comparable to the Great Depression's early stages, required massive government intervention, including bank bailouts and economic stimulus programs that reflected lessons learned from earlier economic disasters. Political polarization has intensified in recent decades as Americans have sorted themselves into increasingly homogeneous political communities, while media fragmentation has enabled people to consume information that confirms their existing beliefs. The rise of social media has accelerated these trends while creating new opportunities for political mobilization and disinformation campaigns that challenge democratic discourse. The election of Barack Obama in 2008 as the first African-American president represented a historic milestone in American racial progress, while generating both celebration and backlash that reflected the persistence of racial tensions. Obama's presidency faced intense opposition from conservative groups, including the Tea Party movement, that questioned his legitimacy and opposed his policy initiatives, including the Affordable Care Act. The 2016 election of Donald Trump marked another significant departure in American politics, as Trump's unconventional campaign style and populist appeals disrupted traditional political patterns while generating intense controversy over his conduct and policies. Trump's presidency highlighted deep divisions in American society over immigration, trade, cultural change, and the nature of American identity that continue to shape contemporary political debates. The COVID-19 pandemic, beginning in 2020, created the most severe public health crisis in over a century, while exposing structural inequalities and institutional weaknesses in American society. The pandemic's economic impact required unprecedented government intervention, while political divisions over public health measures reflected broader disagreements about government authority and individual responsibility. Current challenges facing the United States include managing relations with rising powers like China, addressing climate change and environmental degradation, reducing economic inequality, and maintaining democratic institutions in an era of political polarization and technological disruption. These challenges require both effective governance and social cohesion that have become increasingly difficult to achieve in a diverse and divided society. The ongoing evolution of American democracy continues as each generation faces the responsibility of adapting founding principles to contemporary circumstances while preserving the constitutional framework that has enabled peaceful transfers of power and protection of individual rights for over 2 centuries. The success of this ongoing experiment in self-government depends on citizens' continued commitment to democratic values and institutions, despite the inevitable tensions and conflicts that characterize any free society.
New episodes every week. Subscribe and join our global community of readers and dreamers. Thank you for watching.